So I'd like to welcome you to our first video interview for talk. We now are offering our narrative tradition and to the members of EANT through video. And my first guest is Peter O'Hanrahan, who has been an international trainer, he's core faculty of Enneagram Studies in the Narrative Tradition, founder of Enneagram Work, and probably been putting more air miles in the tradition of the Enneagram than most anyone I know.
Right. Yeah. Yes, I've been traveling around quite a bit in the last few years. Indeed.
Yeah. So we talk about this being a world movement, the Enneagram. The Shift Network just a few days ago had their first global summit on the Enneagram. So there's a lot of conversation right now about the Enneagram reaching to different parts of the world. You want to just maybe give a little history or insights into kind of how you've seen it spread?
Well, you know, from when we were first creating EnneagramWorldwide.com 9 years ago, actually here in this very room, you know, the name, I think you're the one that actually came up with the idea of Enneagram Worldwide, because at that time we were really seriously talking about how to support the Enneagram going to many different countries. And it had just started getting to some places outside the United States through Helen and David primarily traveling, being invited and traveling to other countries. And so we were just about starting to get the EPTP, the Enneagram Professional Training Program, out to other places as well. And 9 years later, the Enneagram, well, the EPTP is in 15 different countries, including the United States, which is pretty remarkable. So I think we've fulfilled that vision that many of us had, you know, 9, 10 years ago.
Yes, and also when I have a chance to go into the Enneagram Worldwide analytics of who visits the website, there's a little map that's created where it shows everywhere that visitors have come to even learn a little taste of the Enneagram, and of the entire globe. There's like a little pocket here in Africa, and there's a little island out here where we haven't reached yet, but it's just amazing. It's like 200 different countries and territories.
Right. And of course we have teachers certified in the narrative tradition in a lot of countries. So I don't know how many exactly, but it's got to be at least 20 or 30 different countries. But the training program is only in 15 countries to date.
And what countries have you been teaching in, say, in the last few years?
Well, my biggest project has been in China for the last 5 or 6 years. You know, Helen was going for a few years, and then she cut back on her traveling, so she had me take over the training of the EPTP. And I work with very good colleagues there. Anita Choi out of Hong Kong has a small training company. And she came to California, you know, quite a long time ago, but then started bringing us over. So now Manita and her colleagues at EPTP.Asia in Qingdao, which is a city on the coast, are the ones who are carrying the narrative tradition forward. And so we probably have 20 teachers now certified in China, who most of them are actually quite busy teaching Enneagram. So that's been a big project. So I've gone to China, you know, once a year, twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year. So I have a lot of air miles to China and back.
And also this year and the last year lately.
Yeah, new country for us. Again, one of our dear colleagues and certified teachers, Suzette Fisher, is in South Africa. And so she has brought the EPTP there now this year and last year. Last year I went with David, and we had a big group. This year I went and worked with Suzette. We had a smaller group, but there's a number of people on the path to teacher certification there. So again, our agenda is to put the narrative tradition, you know, in that country, and it's coming along. Of course, there's also a lot of competition now. So, you know, we're not the only. It used to be there were two major training programs. There was the Enneagram Institute with Don Riso and Russ Hudson, and then there was the Palmer Daniels Narrative Tradition, EBTP. And so we're still, you know, probably the largest programs, but there's an awful lot of newer programs that have come up over the years. So a lot of competition, which can make it harder to actually get something established. People have more choices. Of course, we think ours is the best, but
exactly.
we, you know, not everybody agrees.
Right. So how does the narrative tradition go over, say, in China, of people being on panels and sharing their experiences?
Yeah, well, China's it's both it's a wonderful place to teach. It's also challenging in the sense that I'm working with young Chinese, like I'm way the oldest guy in the room, which is interesting experience for me. But it's the young Chinese, mostly 25 to 35, 25 to 40. And so it's the younger generation. It's people who are well educated, and they come from families with money, generally families who have made it in business. And many of them are business people. And they're interested in, they want to be more successful in what they're doing. They want to have better relationships because that's a whole developing area in China right now, to actually have good, loving relationships with partners. And the third thing is that many of them, not all of them, but many of them are interested in developing an inner life. So the challenge in China is to get people to focus, to go in and down, because it's such an externalized culture. You know, they're making things happen, and it's very fast, it's very competitive. There's a lot of opportunity. People are generally quite exhausted, and they don't have much experience with going inside for self-reflection or self-awareness. So that's one of the things that we bring with the training program, as well as learning about the Enneagram and the 9 types and so on. But you know, our basic method of following the breath, going inside, and working with awareness is great and challenging in China.
Is there a lot of body-centered work in China, or much of it in terms of
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so, no. No, I think that just this year, Marion Gilbert on our training team went over to do her good work there, and she started doing it, so she'll be back. I've done some somatic workshops in the past, and there's a big need for healing work, body work, psychologies of all kinds. They just don't have a lot of good psychology. And I would say Manita Choi, our colleague from Hong Kong, has done tremendous work in bringing satir family therapy to China. That's been her major aim for many, many years. And there are now also other satir trainers and therapists working in China. So something about the Virginia Satir family therapy approach, maybe because it's simple, people can apply it, it works, that has become a very popular method in China. And now there's many other things that are coming into China. So it's a happening place, but it's all pretty new.
So whether you're in China or in another country where English is not the primary language and you're working with a translator, what's that like, being the facilitator and you're working with panels to get what they're trying to communicate and then be able to...
Well, it works, and that's the main thing. I mean, I don't have to hear 100% of everything. I have to get most of what they're saying. And of course I get a lot through body language and through emotional tone and so on. But it is another level of work. I mean, I really have to, you know, and of course I have great translators. And so they're able, I'm not getting simultaneous translation, but I'm getting overlapping translation, meaning the person is talking, the translator is speaking in my ear, and then if the translator needs to slow them down or have them pause for a moment, they'll ask them to do so, because sometimes people get talking really fast. But it takes a little bit longer, but it's not double time. It's maybe another, I don't know, 25% more. but the panel method works. And again, thinking of China, you know, the young people there, they're just so willing to talk about themselves. I mean, they want to talk about themselves. They want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want their stories acknowledged and received by the community. And of course, that's, as we know, the power of the narrative. So that happens in every country we go. And there are some countries we are not in, like Japan, where our understanding is that in Japan, people have much more reticence or reluctance to actually talk about themselves. So the Enneagram is taught there, but not the narrative tradition. So
I know I've met a number of Japanese people who've come to the United States to train.
Right.
So there's little inroads if they were to.
Yeah, we hope we get there with the training program someday.
Exactly.
But that's a different culture, and so the Enneagram is taught differently.
So we were talking earlier about teaching and cultures and honoring the differences of, say, what the religious influences are or other cultural influences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you even talk about the Enneagram.
Well, one of the things that I've learned is to leave out a lot of the Christian terminology. And so in particular, in coming to teach the emotional habits, traditionally called the passions, you know, the 9 passions, based on the 7 deadly sins of Christian tradition plus 2. And there is a long history, and that knowledge was contained within the Christian tradition for many, many centuries. But a lot of the places I go, well, for one thing, people are not Christians, and sometimes they don't even have much Christianity in their culture, like in, let's say, in China, for example. And so recently, I've been trying to revision the emotional habits and really talk about them as emotional experiences rather than just relying on the traditional terms that we have. For example, for type 7, the passion has been described as gluttony. But when we talk about an emotional habit, gluttony is not really an emotion. You know, gluttony is kind of a behavior. And so trying to really get a little further into what's the feeling there. You know, what do 7s actually feel in terms of their emotional habit? You know, that craving more experience, more possibility, and underneath that the fear of limitation, right? And then maybe underneath that also the fear of emptiness.
And you use the word craving.
Craving,
so,
right.
So that's a word
more feeling
you can
based.
relate to as an emotion.
Right.
We all know that experience of craving.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. So that's has kind of happened organically over a period of time. But now I'm a little more focused on. So what's the language actually that for the Chinese or for whoever? You know, I'm actually talking about this currently in my study groups. You know, how would we actually describe in a sentence, in a phrase or two, what are the actual emotional habits? And so some of them work, you know, for type 1, anger, or for type 2, pride. But let's say lust for type 8, you know, I have another way of talking about that.
So as an 8, what emotional word do you?
Well, for example, you know, when I wake up in the morning, and I find myself in a contracted space in my heart and I'm kind of having a bad attitude towards the world, it's not that I'm like, you know, strongly angry. I mean, I know that. I know when I get angry a lot. Right, so, yes. But there is this chronic background contraction of the heart that feels to me more like a kind of a cynicism or a being against the way things are. It's a version of anger. But it's easy for me to miss it because I'm used to anger being this like big deal, and here I'm in this kind of more subtle chronic state where my heart is not open, and I'm aware of that some mornings, and especially when I have to go in and train to, you know, a lovely group of Enneagram students, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, they're all, you know, enthusiastic and waiting with open hearts, and I'm all closed down and being grumpy. It's not lust that I'm experiencing; it's a form of anger, kind of a cynicism that I have to work with as my emotional habit.
Having, you know, communicated about this with all of our core faculty around how the narrative tradition is so alive, and it's not so just lecture oriented. It's keeping everybody, I think, much more fresh in content, because we respond to the moment of the panels, and we're learning through these continued conversations with types over time. I would imagine that the multicultural experiences that you're repeating, again and again, in all these, different environments of age and language and culture, makes it even more, like so much more new information. And I remember when we were sitting here 9 years ago, how we were talking about the Enneagram in terms of the different archetypes. Do you still think in terms of describing it as an archetype when you're into the different countries that are more of a universal?
Well, it goes to the question of who are we, or where does our type come from, and whether we're talking about the personality types or the subtypes. There are these clear archetypal influences. We can also talk about the neurobiology, the patterns, because we know a lot more, from the work that David Daniels and Jack Hillen and others have done. It's like, there's a neurobiological pattern here that I think predates the personality, so to speak. I mean, personality shows up, I think, mostly when we're about 5 or 6, and we can sustain a coherent view of the world, right? We get the idea at that point, like, okay, this is what it's about, and this is my strategy for survival or success. But as parents know, kids show up with a temperament or a certain spark, a certain essential quality that I think is, we could say it's, on one hand, it's genetic inheritance, it's temperament, it's in our biological patterns, and it's also related to human archetypes over the course of history. So.
Thank you. Yeah. Just to wrap things up a little bit, I want to just take a question one more direction in terms of what's next.
Right.
What do you vision for, where do you see the Enneagram headed or growing in terms of whether it's more into the, culturally, is it in different environments, the bit more acceptance in the business world, other places where you might be seeing...
Well, it's different in different countries. That's what's interesting. For example, in Brazil, our colleague Oranio Paes, who trains the EPTP, is also a very well-known business trainer and consultant, and he's done a lot of Enneagram work in companies and corporations there, some of whom are American corporations in Brazil, where here in the United States, it would be much harder to access, right? So something about Brazil at this time, there's a kind of an opening, a renaissance of some kind, and so there's a big expansion there in the business arena. It's also used a lot in France in terms of business training. Not so much people going into companies, but companies in France have to spend a certain amount of their gross income every year on training. And so they send their people usually to smaller training companies off-site. A lot of those companies are now using the Enneagram, particularly our friends at Regard Neuf and Nantes. And also Eric Salmon, who's been teaching the Enneagram, actually doing the EPTP in France for many, many years. So there's a lot of development in the business community and the coaching community, as well as psychology. So it really is different in different countries in that way. So our job is really just to keep trying to, sometimes it's like we're running after something that's already kind of has taken off, and we're just trying to do our best to follow up with, what's happening. I think what we could look at in the years to come is actually initiating, like, for example, what would it take to bring the Enneagram to a place like India, where there's a very large middle class, most of them speak English, why not? And then the other thing that I don't know the answer to is this whole question about the internet. Probably more people these days have learned the Enneagram through the internet than through actually coming to a class or a workshop. and there's a lot of classes and workshops. And actually, Ginger Lapid-Bogda, who does the Enneagram in business trainings, says, well, a lot of people are learning it in organizations, which is true, but so many people learn it through the internet these days. So the question is, how can we follow up and encourage and support those people in actually getting into a deeper level of learning, and maybe even actually show up in the room so that they can learn with their minds and hearts and bodies, not just through, cruising the internet, which I don't want to disrespect, but there's just some questions of how deep it can go. And of course, one of the hot issues these days is people learning on the internet often don't find their type accurately. Right. Because they're taking a test, or they had an idea, or they read something that struck them a certain way, and they don't really have the self-reflection or the process of going in to understand themselves from the inside out.
I think it's a wonderful way to reach and introduce people, and hopefully out of the thousands and thousands and thousands who might have their first taste of the Enneagram online will then feel encouraged to do more. Because, I still go to places where I'm always surprised that a lot of people still haven't heard the word. Like, what is
right.
Enneagram?
It's still that strange sounding
What is
term.
that?
Yeah, what's that, right?
Yeah.
Well, you're in Shreveport, Louisiana now, so can't imagine there's too much Enneagram.
There actually has been some communities there.
Okay.
And they're like a couple in their 80s who have been teaching a long time.
Oh, great.
But I was thinking more when I go to Mexico and teach there, and it's like a whole new audience.
Right. Yeah. Our EPTP's in Mexico these days, hosted and organized by Monica Tinoco and her friends. But then there's also a lot of other programs and people. I mean, it's kind of all sprang up within the last 5 or 6 years in Mexico, and so we'll see how that turns out. And of course, in South America, in Spanish-speaking countries, a lot of people know the Enneagram from Claudio Naranjo from years ago, and some of his teachers who have been kind of at the teaching for all this time. And they have a different approach, and sometimes have different ideas, and there's sometimes a little friction there. Like who's got the real stuff.
Well, we all love the narrative tradition.
Right.
Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to our very first video interview. We'll be back in 3 months.